Well, before I ever stepped into a pulpit like this one, I stood before a classroom filled with high school students in Farmingdale on Long Island, New York, teaching humanities. It was in the late spring of 2005 when I told some of my teacher colleagues that I would be going to seminary that August. At first, they laughed and said, "Right." They were incredulous, saying, "No, really, Flora, what are you going to do for summer vacation?" And others said, "Are you really serious? Are you having a midlife crisis?" "None of the above," I said. I tried to briefly explain as best I could how I felt called by God to serve God's people. My decision to leave the world of teaching and enter the ministry came as a surprise to a lot of people. Now, have you ever been surprised with astonishing news? Has a change of events caught you off guard? Has God intervened in your life and made what seemed impossible a possibility? When God told Abram he would have a son at the age of 100, he laughed. "You've got to be kidding," he must have thought to himself. Imagine his wife, Sarai, who was 90 years old. For God to give them a child at that age would have been preposterous. Now, we tend to live our lives without the expectation that God will surprise us. Rather than be optimistic, we tend to say things like, "That'll never work," or "There's no way." We also live with the age-old problem that we get what we deserve. God, however, is always creating and intervening. And because of God's grace, great things happen. God is a giver of surprises and wants us to believe that a surprise can come at any moment. When I was called into ministry in 2005, I began to make the transition from teaching to becoming the learner, a student at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, now called United Seminary, to a life of ministry. I was well into my teaching career of many years, and the complexity of making that transition seemed impossible, especially with all of the technology. But from the day I said yes and surrendered to the will of God, to the day I gave my first sermon on internship at Hope Lutheran Church in Selden, was 2.5 years later. Both educational and financial windows opened for me to make the journey. I never cease to be amazed at how God works. God is absolutely incredible, and over time I have learned to be patient with God, with myself, and watch things unfold. That's not to say that change isn't a struggle, for it can be. For Sarah and Abraham to have a child in their later years must have been a tremendous challenge. For a woman to give birth is a struggle in and of itself. In the process of transition, life can be like a roller coaster. There are ups and downs, twists and turns that keep us off balance. Nevertheless, it's a journey on which we are not alone. God is always with us. To understand that God can do the impossible, we have to be willing to surrender to God's impossible ways. Because we are people who like to be in control, that's not an easy task. "Walk before me," God said to Abram, "and be blameless." In other words, be willing to make the journey and yield to God's will. Abraham did. Sarah did. I believe that surrendering is one of the most difficult tasks we face as people of faith. We're also influenced by a world that has to be in control and fosters individual independence that we're not in the habit of letting go and yielding to God. In the beginning, Abraham balked at the possibility of having another son. And as time went on, God made a believer out of him, making good on God's promise, on God's covenant. Sarah did in fact give birth to Isaac. As the rest of the story of Abraham unfolds in our daily devotional readings this week, we find him surrendering to God even when it made no sense. For he loved the Lord the God with all his heart, the Shema. God promised the family of faith would grow, and it did. In spite of denying the impossible with laughter, and Sarah laughed as well, Abraham and Sarah became a parent a second time. God expanded their family, and the faith community continued through their lineage. One of the greatest legacies we can give our children and grandchildren is the promise that faith will continue and that the presence of God will be with them forever, everlasting. To accept the ridiculous and absurd ways that God works in our lives is to live with a bold faith. The God we worship is full of surprises, and I think laughter as well. The God we worship can do the impossible. The God we worship promises us future growth and continuation of the faithful forever. Amen.